would like access to a live transcript of this meeting in Spanish. And finally, a live stream of this meeting is also available on RTD's YouTube page. And there is a further housekeeping matter which the chair notes for your scheduling convenience. Just as courts provide breaks for court stenographers during proceedings, we provide breaks for the people running our CART system. So after approximately 90 minutes of meeting time, we will take a brief recess of perhaps 5 to 10 minutes. All right, with the housekeeping out of the way, I would now like to call the roll for the committee members. Director Bob Broom.
Present.
Director Vice Chair Peggy Catlin.
Here.
Director Bobby Deshelle.
Here.
And Second Vice Chair of the Board, Lynn Geisinger.
I'm here.
Committee Vice Chair Michael Guzman.
Here.
And Director Joyanne Rusha.
Present.
And I am the Chair, Doug Tisdale, and I am present. And for the record, I see that we also have with us Director Marjorie Sloan, and I don't see any other directors. Am I missing anyone, Mr. Kroll?
I do not see anybody else either.
Thank you very much. All right, then at this time, I will open public comment to anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic that is listed in the published meeting agenda for this current month or for the immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak and you haven't already done this, please either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone. Now, during this public comment period, the committee will not offer any direct comments or responses to what is said. If you would like to be contacted regarding your public comment, then please email the RTD board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. So may I ask of our executive manager, Jack Kroll, are there any hands raised for public comment at this time?
At this time, Director Tisdale, there are no hands raised.
All right, thank you very much. Then we will dispense with the vocal portion of the public comment. Let me ask, are there any email comments that you have received regarding this Finance and Planning Committee meeting?
Director Tisdale, we did not receive any public comment via email for this meeting in advance.
Well, thank you very much for that. That having been said, with no participants in the queue and no email comments, we will close the public comment period at this time. There is one external entity report on the agenda this evening, and this is our always eagerly anticipated report from the CU Leeds School of Business regarding their semi-annual sales and use tax forecast. I would like to ask Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, to introduce this item and to introduce our most distinguished guests from the CU Leeds School of Business. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening. And as you mentioned, this is the semi-annual sales and use tax forecast update. The CU Leeds School of Business is contracted to provide twice a year sales and use tax forecast, the other one being in April or a March forecast. We present that to this committee in April, and then this is the September 2024 forecast being presented this month, October 2024. Incidentally, the sales and use tax forecasted numbers for 2025 from the medium forecast will be used in the budget the budget as well as the proposed budget discussion for 2025 later this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Robert McNown and Brian Lewandowski for their continued excellent work providing these numbers to us. And gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Hey. Thank you very much, Doug, and thank you to the RTD board for your attention this evening. I'm Brian Lewandowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Business Research Division at the Leeds School of Business, University of Colorado Boulder. Tonight, I'm joined by Robert McNown, who has been a partner in this project since its inception back in I think it was 2010 or 2011. And my other colleagues who work on this, Richard Wabikind, Miles Light, and Adam Illig could not make it tonight. Rich is actually teaching in our executive MBA program and may show up a few minutes late, if at all. So very briefly, I plan to run through some observations in the macroeconomic environment. Then, per usual, I will turn it over to Robert to share the summary of the RTD sales and use tax forecast. So we like to take a look at this big, broad measure of the U.S. economy, looking at gross domestic product. And I put this up here only briefly to show that GDP continues to grow. And remember, this is real GDP. It's already adjusted for inflation. So this is real growth in output in our economy. And I think what was notable in the second quarter of 2024 is that there was a reacceleration in GDP growth from the first quarter to the second quarter, growing at a 3% annualized rate and also coincidentally 3% year over year for the quarter. And I think when we looked into the details, it was interesting to see a reacceleration in the components of GDP as well. So investment reaccelerated to over 8%. It was a lot on the equipment side. We saw real acceleration in government spending. And perhaps most importantly for RTD is that there was some real acceleration in consumption, which then downstream, as it turns into retail activity, ends up translating to sales and use taxes for your district. The expectation is that the third quarter will continue to show pretty good growth. GDP now from the Atlanta Fed is projecting about 3% growth. When we take a look at consensus forecasts, we're expecting 2.2% growth or so for the full year this year. But just note that the expectation for 2025 is a little bit slower growth. Okay. So I'm going to just point out 4 observations within the macroeconomy. And point number 1 is that labor market pressures are easing. And that's not to say that market pressures are easy. It's just that they're easing. So we've seen a slightly slowing trend in job growth. And I put the last 4 years up here because it really illustrates the remarkable recovery from the pandemic recession, with average monthly job growth of over 600,000 a month in 2021. And then that slowed to 377,000 in 2022 as we reached that peak level of employment. And so as we reached the new record level, as we recovered all of those jobs from the recession. But I think somewhat to my surprise is we continued to grow jobs at a pretty robust rate in 2023, 251,000 jobs. And even now in 2024, 200,000 jobs a month on average. But that September number that came out, 250,000, that was somewhat of an upside surprise for us as we have studied the labor market. Another indication of the tight labor market easing perhaps a little bit is taking a look at the job openings rate within our economy and the number of unemployed individuals within the economy. So the red line shows job openings, and you can clearly see the spike that happened after the pandemic, a lot of demand for workers, a lot of job openings, but that trend has been coming down, and it's almost sort of converging with the number of unemployed people. So we went from having a ratio of job openings to unemployed of about 2. Now we're down to about 1.1 openings for every unemployed person within the national economy. And within the Colorado economy, that trend is also coming down. It's a little bit more volatile. But you can see that the general trend is the same, decreasing rate of openings, increasing rate of unemployed. But we actually have the fourth highest job openings rate in the country. And our ratio of job openings to unemployed is 1.6 to 1. So it shows that we have a slightly tighter labor market in Colorado compared to the nation overall. I think it's also interesting to note that Colorado has the second highest quits rate in the country, people voluntarily leaving their job. And so the market hasn't deteriorated to a point that people feel like they need to stay in their current job and hunker down. They're still voluntarily leaving their positions. So point number 2 is that inflation is normalizing. We've seen inflation really make a fairly rapid recovery. It took about 16 months for the national rate of inflation. Once it crossed 2%, it took 16 months for us to reach the peak. And now it took only about 12 months for it to come back to about 3%. For another year, it oscillated between 3 and 4%. And now what we've seen over the last couple of months is that inflation, national inflation, dropped below that 3% level. Now, remember that the Fed target rate of inflation is 2%. And what you can see on the table here is that the July number for the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood region was 1.9%. So we actually led the nation down when it came to price growth. This hasn't been our history. 11 of the last 14 years, Colorado, or the Denver metro region rather, has had higher rates of inflation than the nation. So it's sort of interesting that we're leading the nation down right now. And one reason that we're leading the nation down is our housing inflation is coming in lower than the national rate of inflation. Point number 3 is that interest rates are decreasing. This isn't by accident. This is Fed policy reacting to what I was just showing you a moment ago is, a pretty stable employment market, but easing a little bit and easing prices. That's the Fed's dual mandate is stable price growth around 2% and full levels of employment. So they cut interest rates by 50 basis points or 0.5% earlier this month or late last month. And the expectation is for about another 50 basis points to happen this year. But you can see on this slide how it's impacted the very short-term rates, which is what the Fed really has control over, but it also has had an impact on longer rates. If you take a look out to the 30-year mortgage rate, we've seen some downward pressure on mortgage rates. Okay, and my fourth point here is that consumption is moderating. So I'd say those first 3 points are fairly positive. I'd say this fourth point is somewhat of a concern, right? So the chart on the left is showing you national retail sales growth and Colorado taxable sales. And for both of these series, Colorado, sort of tracks the nation when it comes to retail activity. We saw the spike after the pandemic, and then we've sort of seen this moderating growth as we marched through the 3 consecutive next years following 2021. And we've had so many concerns about consumer, the consumer, and about consumption, and what that means for retail activity. I think what's positive for us is that we continue to see growth in consumption nationally. We're seeing real personal income growth. We're seeing real wage growth, and so I think that this idea that the consumer is going to be the cause of the next recession, that concern is somewhat abated for the time being. We've even seen an increase in the savings rate as of late. On the right side, you can see national retail activity by product type, and you can see how behaviors have somewhat shifted over the last few years, right? So during the pandemic, we saw really rapid growth in sporting goods sales, and now this has come down and it's actually negative. Or we saw a lot of home improvement projects, and now we're seeing building material and garden equipment actually shrink a little bit. Gasoline stations on the very bottom, this is just a very price sensitive measure. It's really dependent on the price of gasoline versus the change in volumes of gasoline. Very quickly on Colorado, I like to put this ranking slide up each time. It benchmarks Colorado to the rest of the nation. And I put this up here now to show you that Colorado's economy seems to be slowing a little bit ahead of the nation. Not saying that Colorado is in a recession or that we're having slow growth. It's just that we seem to be lagging the nation when it comes to the ranking for GDP or for job growth. But we're still leading the nation when it comes to average annual pay, wage growth, and labor force participation. In fact, Colorado has the highest level of labor force that we've ever had in the state's history, showing sort of that eagerness for Coloradans to work. Our current forecast for 2024 employment growth in the state is 1.7%. And the next time we chat with you, we'll have our 2025 forecast primed and ready to share. Headwinds and tailwinds. I think the headwinds are where I'm going to focus for just a moment. Inflation still is a headwind. It is coming down, but we also shouldn't expect that the price of cereal is going to return back to what we were paying 3 or 4 years ago. It just means that we're on a new, more normal trajectory of growth for prices. It doesn't mean that prices are going to go back to where they were, and that's a real struggle for many households. Continued issues in Colorado, property taxes, cost of insurance. We think these are headwinds for property owners as well as for renters. Office vacancy. I think there's still some downward pain to be felt in the office commercial real estate market, driven by office vacancy and the slow return to the office. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and I'm going to pass it over to Robert to share about 4 slides or so on the RTD sales and use tax forecast. Robert?
Yes, thanks, Brian. So Brian's provided the context, the macroeconomic background that really drives our forecasts. Of course, the Colorado economy depends on what's happening nationwide, but not 100%. There's not a lockstep relation between the Colorado economy and the U.S. economy, and that is depicted by the ranking slide that Brian just presented for you, showing how some of our indicators diverge or are unusually high or unusually low compared to other states. But still, the U.S. economy is an important driver of what's going on in Colorado. And so we rely on forecasts of key macroeconomic variables coming from Moody's Analytics. Moody's provides several alternative scenarios based on different assumptions, which of these headwinds or tailwinds are likely to really materialize. We made a judgment, the BRD team made a judgment that the baseline scenario that Moody's thinks is the most likely was a little too optimistic. And so we've blended the baseline from Moody's with a more pessimistic one. And the resulting scenario is what's depicted here in the table. And just to focus on 2024, that row there, note that most of the indicators are looking moderately strong, but that percent change in retail sales at 1.8%, that mirrors what Brian was talking about in his 4th point about the weaknesses in consumption. And that, of course, is the most immediate or direct driver of what's going on in terms of RTD tax revenues. Let's go to the next slide. So So here is a similar table of these indicators for the state of Colorado. And so again, looking at retail sales, growing at 1.8% in 2024. And that certainly is the source of weakness that we see in RTD revenues that you're going to see soon. Otherwise, the other indicators are reasonably strong. Personal income in particular growing at over 5%, continuing moderately strong in the next 2 years, 2025, 26. The unemployment rate remains fairly low. There seems to be a little bit of weakness in the labor market in 2025, with employment growing only at 0.3%. That could be supply issues in the sense that immigration, both into the U.S. and into the state, is not as strong as it has been. Let's keep some of these numbers in mind. We'll go on to the next slide too. Yeah, and so here's the bottom line. What's the most important to us is, of course, what's happening to retail sales and therefore sales tax revenues. So we see that in 2023, our growth in sales and use tax revenues was really very poor, almost zero, almost flat, growing at only 0.3%. And our current projection for 2024, of course, we have at least 7 years of information on this already. And so we're projecting over the entire year only 1% growth in sales and use taxes. And then much more of a recovery in 2025, growing at 4.2% sales and use tax revenues. And the big difference there in the turnaround is focused on a few key components in 2025, in particular general merchandise, which includes online retail, home centers, and then also a very strong rebound in use tax revenues, most likely due to a pickup in construction activity. So that's what we have to look forward to in the short run, the rest of this year and into next year. Let's go to the next slide. And we do continue these projections out to 2030 to fit the RTD medium-term planning horizon. And this is a representation of what our forecasts have looked like over the 5 most recent updates. And I think it's quite remarkable that how these lines have pretty much the same slope. I mean, they start off with some divergences from each other, but for the most part, the long run rates of growth seem to be in line, haven't changed that much over time. So suggesting the model has some stability, which kind of reassures me as the technical guy behind the model here. And so this next slide, this focuses on our current forecast out to 2030. So in the middle there, you see the label on baseline forecast. So that's what we consider the most likely scenario. And then we've got an optimistic and a pessimistic forecast that encompasses that. The pessimistic one, you can see that in 2025, it's actually going down. So that's a recession forecast, a moderate recession forecast, and then a recovery. But again, we feel the baseline forecast is the most likely outcome here. And this final slide. So we also do our forecast. This is an entirely different model where we have built the complete system of equations for both the U.S. and the Colorado economy to forecast retail sales and use tax revenues out to 2050 on an annual basis. And I think the most notable part of this forecast here is, if you look on the last column of that table, that you can see that from the current decade, 2021 to 2030, where taxable sales for RTD are averaging 6.2% growth over those 10 years. And then it's coming down dramatically in the 2030s and even further in the 2040s. And this is a result of demographic drag that's built into the model, capturing both the declining rate of growth in the total population and, most importantly, an aging of the population. So I think those forecasts are somewhat discouraging, but kind of the reality of what might happen if population continues to somewhat stagnate as is currently projected. And then our final slide is just to reassure you that we've done the best job we can to bring in the most recent economic data. We realize the forecast may be too high or too low, and so we always want to present that uncertainty through these confidence bounds, these high and low forecasts, as well as the different scenarios. We've tried to use what are the theoretically most sound econometric relations and methodologies, and we don't incorporate add factors as some forecasters do, but instead we rely on the model forecast, which we believe is what we've been contracted to do for RTD. And I just want to highlight that we really appreciate the support of Doug McLeod and his staff and doing these updates and getting us the data and so promptly. And it's always been a pleasure working with the whole RTD team. We have any questions? We're open for that.
All right, we thank you very much, gentlemen, for your observations, and I'm certain that there will be questions. I have a couple that I'd like to bring up, but first I'll open up. Are there any comments or questions from any members of the committee regarding the CU Leeds school forecast? Boy, gentlemen, you really blew them away today. Oh, okay, Mr. Vice Chair.
I'll start us off. Thank you so much for the report, and I do appreciate very much that you took a more pessimistic view than Moody's. That tends to be my go-to, so thank you for that, and thank you for stating that. It is unfortunate, but I do think that this is much more realistic than what I was than what could have been presented, and so I appreciate that. I just wanted to thank you for that because I know I might be pretty liberal and progressive on a lot of things, but the economy is not one that I want to play with, and I'm far too on the conservative side of that one. So like always, I'm glad that our fiscal policy pushes us towards a more conservative view on things. And I do appreciate that you made the remark specifically about the pessimism with Moody's rosy outlook, because I disagreed with what I saw when I looked at theirs, and I was like, this makes more sense. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. We appreciate that. And I will note for the sake of the record that Dean Wobbekind has now joined us in this meeting as well. So Richard, as always, it is a privilege to have you with us, sir. All right, and let's go to Director Broom.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to pose the question, if the tax increases being voted on are approved by the voters in Denver, will that have any impact on our sales tax collections?
Gentlemen, who wants to field that one?
I'm afraid go ahead, Brian.
We haven't specifically studied it, Director Broom, so I sort of hesitate to comment on it. I think that generally what we think about is any sort of tax increase or cost increase for consumers can have a crowding out effect when it comes to purchasing other, taxable items. So that's my general response without looking at the impact of those specific tax increases.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director, and thank you, Brian, for that answer. Let me turn now to Director Rusha. You are recognized.
Thank you, sir. So I'm just looking through, and also so thank you for the presentation and this thorough report. So I feel like I'm going to be embarrassed if I was a student who missed the slide or the paragraph. But I was wondering if we have like a breakout, or if anyone could comment if it feels relevant on like the use tax portion of our collection, and if we saw any like trends that might actually impact like in a meaningful way our revenues.
Thank you
Just
very
on the use, on the use part of the retail and use, because that is I was just wondering if there was any thoughts about that.
Thank you, Director Rushin. I think Brian might have an answer. As I understand it, I think use tax constitutes about 6% of our total, and sales tax is about 94%. But Brian, why don't you expand upon that, please?
I'll start, and then I think Robert's primed to say something too. Yes, you're right. It is less than 10%. I think it's about 6% right now, and thank goodness it is, because it's a really difficult series to forecast. It's extremely volatile. It can go up double digits and down double digits any given quarter or any given year. But we do model out those series specifically. Robert, do you want to comment on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so in the current year, 2024, we project that RTD use tax revenues are actually going negative, a slight negative at minus 2.3%. And then a tremendous rebound in 2025, growing at 17%. And so that just reinforces what Brian was saying about how volatile that series is. Generally, this is driven by construction activity. That's probably the most important factor there. And so the forecast for 2025 is assuming some pretty strong growth in home building and other types of construction.
From your lips to God's ears, Robert. So we appreciate that. Director Rusha, did you have any follow-up on that?
No, sir, that was sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Broom, I see your hand is raised again, so you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. There is a strong market now for rental properties, and there's a lot of new construction underway. When does the actual use tax on those building materials get collected? At the front end of the projects or at the tail end, or how does that work?
Robert, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Well, Brian's the expert on this, but he's told me that it's at the time of the permitting that those fees are collected. Yeah,
That should be right.
All right, thank you for that affirmation, Brian. Director Broom, did that answer your question?
It did. That's what I thought. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Yes, well, with your municipal experience, I would expect you to know that too. All right, other questions from other committee members, and then I'll ask if there are any board members, and I know Director Sloan, I think, is the only one, but Mr. Vice Chair, you are recognized.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find the page that it was on in the packet, but there is a reference to packet page 40, sorry. Yeah, packet page 46, figure 3, which deals with the US population shares and shows the growth just for like planning purposes and understanding the direction that we might have to take going forward. The youngest population is on the decline, in the populations age 50 and older are the ones that are growing, which tracks with the state of Colorado's I can't think of
demographer.
Thank you. That's the word. Demographer statistics that we saw last year and that have been updated since. But we know that the majority of our writers are on that particular chart, that blue line, according to some of the information that we have, that 30 to 49 age people going to work, and that's going to stay steady. It's not going to grow. And so when we're looking at this in terms of going into the plan for what next year's budget may look like and what services we need to provide, a consideration for those that are advancing in age and their needs is something that we'll need to consider. While the younger population is one that's going to decline for a while. It caught my eye because we've heard this several times, and I think that this has implications in other areas as well, not just for taxes, but also for what we provide as service. But I'm also thinking about my grandparents who are paying taxes on their house, and my mother and my aunts and uncles, and what that means for them. So just a comment more than anything. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Vice Chair. And the change in the population in Colorado is something that we've often talked about in the past. We used to speak of the silver tsunami, and we're definitely in the midst of the silver tsunami now, where those of us who are advantaged with silver hair are certainly increasing in number. Brian, yes, please, Mr. Lewandowski.
Yeah, thanks. If I can, I'd like to just respond to that comment about population. Just wanted to call out that in those charts, if it's the one that I think you're referring to, it's showing the percent of population or sort of the market share of population. So for Colorado, all of the age cohorts are expected to grow in population over the time horizon, but the oldest age cohort is supposed to grow by the most. So they're going to pick up market share. Even the youngest cohort and that working age cohort are expected to grow, but that youngest age cohort will grow by the slowest amount so that their market share gets smaller while that working age population sort of maintains itself. So overall, we still expect Colorado's population to get bigger. It's just going to look a lot different because of people aging in place here. And we do leverage the state demographers' population forecasts for this project. So there's clear consistency there. Thanks.
Thank you for that expansion. We appreciate that. And our board second vice chair, Director Geisinger, you are recognized.
Thanks so much. And thank you all for this report. It's always really helpful for planning. And I'm following up on the same thing that, you know, this decade it projected 6.2% growth in the sales tax and sales and use tax, and then the 2040s it's 2.3%, and it's a huge difference. It's sort of a sobering. And are there other things besides the aging? What are you looking at that's bringing it down so much?
Yeah, the other thing to keep in mind is that that really high rate of growth in revenues in the current decade is to some extent due to the recovery from the pandemic. So the big downturn was prior to this decade, and then just coming out of that. So maybe that's an abnormally high rate of growth over for a decade and under our current economic situation. So if you went back to a previous decade, it'd probably be more on the order of 4 to 5%, I guess. But your observation is still spot on that aside from that surge in the current decade, in the future decades, it is the demographic drag that's bringing that down, those rates down. And it's a powerful force. And you look at the figure 4 that the director was referring to, figure number 3. It looks like these demographic changes are very small, but their impact is large, and it's it could even be well, of course, we're using the projections that the state demographer's office can provide us with, but it's difficult for them to anticipate what's happening in terms of immigration policies and how that could really affect the working age population, where often there's a concentration of migrants in that working age group. So there's a lot of uncertainty in these demographic forecasts, and even small changes there can have powerful impacts on that long run economic growth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Geisinger. Appreciate the question. It prompts me to recall what I learned years ago from a gentleman who had a large firm on Wall Street. Remember, if you lose half of your investment, you realize you're going to need to double your investment worth just to get back to where you were, which is something that people don't always remember. And the same thing works with population estimates. Mr. Vice Chair, you are recognized.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I do believe that Dean Wobbekin was trying to speak and get your attention. I don't know. Okay, never mind. We're good.
Good.
I
think
was trying to speak, but I was deferring to you to speak first.
okay,
The
yes,
forecast,
please, Dean Wobbekin, yes.
I was just going to ask my colleague, Robert, the forecasts are also in nominal terms, right?
The revenue forecasts, yeah, we do it both in real and nominal terms, but what was presented in the slide was nominal.
Right.
So
part of the 6%, it wasn't only just the impact of all of the spending, but it was all the inflation over the last several years, which also drove a higher rate of growth in terms of the retail sales flows. And we're not building that kind of an inflation rate into the model going forward. So just
good point, Rich.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, now, Director Sloan, I think you're the only non-committee director in this meeting, so let me just open the floor to you if you have any comments or questions.
No, the comment is that this is very enlightening and I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. No, we always learn a lot from the CU Lead School of Business when they come in semi-annually. I wanted to refer back to your RTD forecast Colorado economic indicators, and you noted that for 2025, the percent change in retail sales you have projected at 1.9%. And then when I look at the next page, the baseline RTD revenue forecast, you're showing a projection of growth of 4.2%. So I was trying to align those two numbers and wondered if anybody could perhaps offer some further enlightenment on that.
Yeah, that's a really insightful observation. And it's certainly one that I paid a lot of attention to. How could we get what seem to be such different projections of what are similar economic phenomena? So when we forecast sales and use tax revenues for RTD, we don't simply forecast a total, an aggregate that is total revenues. Instead, we break down into individual components that, such as food stores, restaurants and hotels, online sales, which is a part of the general merchandise component, and then building materials, home center sales. And it can happen that some of those individual components, which are really important sources of tax revenues for RTD, don't move in lockstep with the overall aggregates, the overall retail sales. And so what's happening, according to our forecast for 2025, is considerable strength in some of those key components. And that's particularly in the case of general merchandise, which I mentioned was online sales as well, that home centers were coming in real strongly. And then also that 4.2% that you're referring to includes the use tax revenues, which are really booming in 2025, growing at 17%. So the answer, the way it's reconciled is that some individual components are, fortunately for RTD, going to be doing very well in 2025.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that explanation. It helps put things in better context. Director Ruscia, I see your hand. You are recognized.
Thank you, sir. I might have actually had a different version of what you just noted. So please feel free to interrupt if I sound redundant. But I was also going back to what Director Geisinger had noted, and I just want to check for understanding and make sure that I'm kind of getting the gist of this report here. So prior to the pandemic, RTD there were some financial challenges, and we remember that. And then when the pandemic came, we braced for impact, but consumer spending stayed strong, or despite the economic conditions of many. And when the base price of something rises, so will the sales tax collection, but obviously that can hit a point at which the other factors will start to weigh in, and consumer spending can drop. So if I'm understanding this correctly, like what we did is I hate to say the word benefit, we benefited from a period of unprecedented inflation, and now we're in a period of potential deflation, and that plus other factors that you mentioned is essentially suggesting that we need to be pretty conservative in our fiscal modeling moving forward. And is that an accurate summary of the big picture for a layperson, and did that accurately capture things that pre-2022, a lot of the slides talk about in the pandemic era? I just want to check for understanding and make sure that is what I heard.
Thank you. I appreciate that question. And let me go to Dean Wolbekind for his.
I wanted to let Robert comment first, and then if
Robert,
he looks like he's ready.
He's ready.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I was hoping that Rich or Brian would set the macroeconomic context there, because the pandemic upset so many things in different directions. An additional factor besides the well, as the director mentioned, there was a consumption expenditures held up quite well, and of course that was a result of policies at the federal level. All the cash that was injected into households, something that, of course, we couldn't anticipate until it actually came to pass, and that was really produced some remarkable and unexpected strength in RTD revenues at that period. And then, of course, that was followed by the inflation, which, of course, you've pointed out too, was beneficial to RTD in terms of revenues. Now, of course, that means your costs go up too, so it's not a total blessing for you. And what's happening further, also a fallout from the pandemic was this move away from the office and work from home. And as I understand it, the Denver metro area is still lagging on that in terms of recovery of usage of office space. And so that directly impacts RTD revenues coming from workers who are coming into the city, buying lunch, shopping downtown, and so on. So, yeah, what can I say? It's complicated, but that does introduce a lot of uncertainty, and that's why from year to year you see the forecast as well as the reality of rates of growth of RTD revenues going up and down in a really volatile fashion. I'm open to further comments from Rich too.
Well, to paint that macro thing, I'm sorry, Robert, I dumped the question on it so quickly. To paint the macro thing a little bit further, and all of the longer term forecasts for GDP are certainly showing a trending down in long-term economic growth in the US. Some of that being driven by demographics, which is also affecting retail sales. We tend to see older populations buy less goods and taxable goods and more services as part of their overall consumption bundle, including health services that, aren't taxed. So it's a kind of a natural tendency with an aging population, but there's also just a national sort of scenario that we're following here, excuse me, here, that shows with the aging demographic, productivity slows down and therefore GDP growth slows down. And then the next piece, adding on to, all the fiscal stimulus, we also had zero interest rates, so people could buy, with and pay off over time with a zero interest rate. And I don't envision, certainly the interest rates went up and we all know that story, but I don't envision them going back down to zero in this recovery. I mean, we're targeting a number like 3% in the next year and a half is going to be sort of the resting place. So that also would be, in terms of slowing retail sales and credit card purchases and all of those things, because it's a more costly thing to do in terms of cost of capital, if you will, cost of expenditures. So all of that's built in, and the national scenarios aren't much different than that, is what I'm trying to emphasize, I guess.
Thank you very much. I think that's well said, and I've got some observations I'll share after we hear from Director Broom.
Thank you, Chair. I don't recall anybody mentioning artificial intelligence. Is that likely to have any impact on our sales and use tax?
It's likely to. I think there's so much uncertainty over how that's going to play out. Some people talk about the impact on labor markets and displaced workers. Others just point to increased productivity. How's that all going to shake down? Well, our forecasting model is grounded in historical data. So unfortunately, that doesn't help us answer those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have heard several directors on the committee indicate that the more conservative, or if you will, pessimistic forecast is something that should guide us as we go forward, given what we have all encountered. And last month, in my capacity as the chair of the Denver Downtown Development Authority, I shared with the executive committee a report, and then that report was included by board executive manager Jack Kroll in the board packet that we had for last month, that gave very sobering statistics concerning downtown Denver and the loss of businesses and the loss of rentals and the lack of construction. And in fact, particularly for the upper downtown area, an actual net migration out of the upper downtown area, so that the population was decreasing. So all of those factors, coupled with the information you have provided to us, I think inform us to be cautious and, as Vice Chair Guzman said, conservative in approaching some of these issues. Let me ask, are there any other comments from any committee member or from, yes, and Director Ruscia, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you, sir. So I'm looking at the transcript and I realized that earlier I said deflation. I said disinflation. Deflation, we'd have an all hands on deck scenario, and I absolutely don't want to invoke the Beetlejuice or, put a hex on us for saying that out loud. But I just wanted to make sure that the record was, corrected in case anyone was reading this later. But again, thank you for this presentation, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I did have a couple of thoughts about, how do we move forward with the information we're given? And I'm going to presume that in Mr. McLeod's presentation, we can ask follow-ups there because that should sort of track with what we just got. So again, thank you. And I just wanted to make sure I corrected the record and again, didn't invoke any bad luck on our part.
Look at that. And from the person who says that she's a layman in the area, and distinguishing between deflation and disinflation. Well done. All right, any other comments, observations, questions from any director? Hearing none, gentlemen, once again, always a privilege and always informative. We thank you so much for your continuing relationship with us and providing this semi-annual forecast. It is a privilege to work with each of you, Rich and Robert and Brian. You do a great job and we thank you for your great work.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
We have two recommended actions on the agenda this evening. The first action concerns the 2025 investment policy. The recommended action is for the Board of Directors to approve the 2025 investment policy. Is there a motion?
So moved, Guzman.
Second,
And a second. So I have the movant is Vice Chair Guzman, and the second is Board Second Vice Chair Geisinger. And I will now call upon Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, and Brendan Morgan, our Senior Manager of Debt and Investments, to present this item to us. Mr. McLeod, let's begin with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll be very brief for this item. It was presented as a discussion item on September 10th at the Finance and Planning Committee. There are a few grammatical changes, and within the package, there's both a final version as well as a red line version showing the changes from the previous year. We generally bring the investment policy once a year for board approval for the upcoming fiscal year. However, if anything were to change significantly, we certainly would bring that back to the board. We being staff, bring that back to the board to make any necessary changes. If there's statute changes or market changes, et cetera. However, there have not been any other additional changes that we as staff has made to that investment policy since the September 10th discussion item. So we are seeking board approval to accept that and use that as guidance for 2025. And Brendan and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate that. And yes, as noted, we did have an extensive discussion on this previously, but it comes before us now as a recommended action. And so it is up to us to have a final discussion and questions and then to proceed with a vote. So at this time, I would ask those directors who have questions or who wish to speak on this matter to please raise your virtual hands, and I'll call on you in turn. And recall, and I don't believe there is anybody who's on the phone with us, but if you were on the phone, we would ask you simply to press *9. So with that having been stated, are there any directors with questions or comments for either Mr. McLeod or Mr. Morgan on the financial policy? Hearing none, we'll close discussion on that. And as to the motion that was made by Vice Chair Guzman and seconded by Board Second Vice Chair Geisinger, are there any no votes on this action? Having paused and waited for an expression of no votes and hearing none, then the motion passes unanimously with all of the committee members voting in favor of the investment policy for 2025. Thank you all very much. The second recommended action this evening concerns the 2025 fiscal policy. The recommended action is for the Board of Directors to approve the 2025 fiscal policy. Is there a motion?
So moved.
And a second?
second,
I have Board Vice Chair Catlin as the movant and Second Vice Chair Geisinger as the second. And I would now once again call upon Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, to present this item. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you again. The 2025 fiscal policy was presented as a discussion item at the May 14th, 2024 Finance and Planning Committee, and also again at the July Finance and Planning Committee with some changes recommended. Those changes came from board recommendations through the Revenue Diversification Working Group and other suggestions, as well as we also as staff incorporated some changes through the Office of the State Auditor recommendations surrounding certain fund balance policies and presentations of budget documents, et cetera. And then finally, we ensured that there was a reference included in there also to using Government Finance Officers Association best practices in our budgeting policy. So there's just a few more changes in this than the investment policy. Also added a discussion about TABOR in anticipation of TABOR continuing to be in effect for revenue growth limitations beyond the election. So we are being conservative with that. Our intent as staff would be to come back if those results happen to be in favor of maintaining the debrucing for RTD. We would come back as staff after the election in November, discuss with the board changing some of those policies specific to TABOR. So we have not made any additional changes as staff to this, to the recommended changes that are in the red line copy. Again, the red line is the changes from the prior fiscal policy for 2024 approved by the board versus what we're asking to be approved for 2025. And then finally, I would note that the budget, as well as the 5-year financial forecast that was approved in September, all align with the 2025 fiscal policy. That's really due to the timing is really due to us wanting to have that policy in place because that's how the budgetary appropriations are developed in alignment with that fiscal policy. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to present and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And let me simply underscore one point that you made for the benefit of all who have considered in the past the impact of the report of the Office of State Auditor, that this policy takes into account and addresses all of the recommendations that were made by the Office of State Auditor based upon their findings from their audit of RTD. So at this time, once again, we will ask directors who have questions or who wish to speak, please raise your virtual hands. I'll call upon you in turn. And I will begin with recognizing Director Ruscia.
Thank you, sir. So I have a question, and it's on packet page 116 under fund balance policies, and it's related to item number 4, which is the FISA. Is it correct to say that what we are adding here is just a summary of previously passed board policy, and we're kind of codifying or restating it in our fiscal policy?
Thank you very much, Director. And let me turn to Mr. McLeod to respond to that.
Yes, thank you for the question. And yes, that is exactly what we are doing, is trying to embed that within the fiscal policy, just those summary level assumptions of how the FISA is managed. We've done similar things with the other fund balance policies, as you can see within the fiscal policy, just describing what the purpose of that fund balance is for. And again, this is a board policy, so certainly subject to board change at any time.
Thank you. And Director Ruscia, does that respond to your question?
It does. And I just have if I could just follow up, and because I was previously unclear about our policy regarding sales and lease revenues. So under B it says like sales and lease opportunities for all RTD properties. I see it says all, but I just want to clarify, like if we were to sell a piece of property, would that automatically go into the FISA, or does that come before the board and then the board makes that individual determination?
Mr. McLeod.
Based on the policy, yes, all sales of properties and leases of properties, new leases of properties would automatically go into the FISA based on those prior instructions, and certainly the board could change that direction. I would point out that even though the FISA is specific to fast tracks projects, funding of fast tracks projects or fast tracks initiatives, that even base system sales or leases of property also flow into the FISA too. So it was all encompassing when it comes to those types of transactions. Funding automatically goes into the FISA. And I would say that generally speaking, last month, Chessie Brady presented a transit-oriented development opportunity where part of that is a purchase of land. I believe it was $1.5 million from RTD. Of course, that has not yet occurred, but when that would occur, that money would automatically go into the FISA.
Thank you, sir. And just one more, just to further clarify. Thank you, Mr. McLeod. That's what I thought the policy was, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't looking at an outdated document. You know what I mean? When I was pulling these up. So I also just noticed, because we referenced lease opportunities, and I wanted to just make sure, was that always, so leasing revenues always go into the FISA? Has that always been the case, or would that be new? The sales piece, the property sales, I did know that to be part of our FISA policy, but I just wanted to make sure that leasing revenue has always been the case with the FISA.
Ms. McLeod, that is, again, my understanding as well.
Yes, that is correct. In fact, nothing really policy-wise in terms of what the FISA is available for or how it is funded has changed since circa 2013, since it was first established. The only activity that may have changed within there is actually asking the board to approve certain appropriations, actually spending the money, the most recent of which was the $8 million at the time estimated cost for the Northwest Rail Peak Service study that was funded from the FISA, for instance. But yeah, all those things are original, including leases.
Thank you very much, Ms. McLeod. Director Ruscia, does that respond to your questions?
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to ensure everything I'm seeing in red related to the sacred cow is just how it has been. We are just codifying it here. So thank you, Mr. McLeod, for your time. I also, and I pardon if I'm out of order, I think I had just a general request before, yeah, I'll vote yes tonight, before we get to our full board meeting. If as our chair mentions, because we have some things that are tracking along with the auditor's recommendation, I think it would be helpful if just like a brief memo to the board, just highlighting, where we have done that. Not to say we didn't, but just as a follow-up, I think that would be helpful as we go into the board meeting, because there was a lot of discussion about that. And I think it would just be good for us to show that we're being responsive. And but with that was all I had. And thank you for your time, Mr. McLeod.
The phrase "trust but verify" springs to mind as you describe that. Executive Manager Jack Kroll, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Committee Chair Tisdale. I just wanted to flag something for what you said prior to opening up the floor to Director Ruscia. The fiscal policy before you all contains updated information relative to the OSA's recommendations with respect to the fiscal policy, but does not contain all recommendations from the OSA. So I just wanted to flag that for the record there. If you all tune in to next week's executive committee meeting, we'll have an update there on another item that the OSA flagged. Actually, two items. So.
No, I appreciate that. That's right. The purview of this committee obviously is finance and planning, and the initial purview of the Office of State Auditor was, of course, a financial audit. But there are performance audit elements that they went beyond their charge of a financial audit. Any further comments, questions, observations from any committee member or any director on the call relative to this? Director Ruscia, once again.
Thank you, sir. So on packet page 117, because that's where you can see the red line, there is a note on number 5 regarding the budget shall be summarized for adoption purposes. And that's something we've talked a lot about as a committee and as a board. And that came up during our last budget approval meeting last year. And so I'm reading this, as simply restating what is already required under statute. Is that accurate, or the changes, excuse me, is that an accurate capture, or are we going beyond what is required under Colorado local budget law in that bullet number 5?
Well, as to the first sentence in number 5, the budget shall be summarized for adoption purposes. That's actually not a change in the policy. The red language that shows on page 117 of the packet is the new language. And I'll let Mr. McLeod respond to your direct question of, does this impose a greater burden on us than is required by state law or the recommendations of the Office of State Auditor? Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. And I believe this is taken from state statutes, and I believe the intent of this is not to provide a 1,000-page document with every line item and department, which is why we're including it here in our fiscal policy for RTD. I would note that the second sentence talks about how it's really up to the board's discretion to determine what level of detail that is presented at. And as we get into the budget conversation, 2025 budget conversation, I think we've hopefully checked all the boxes in terms of the board's desires in terms of what they wanted to see, adding additional transparency, et cetera. So I'd say we go beyond, quite a bit beyond that. In fact, really following the GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association's best practices. They also have a checklist, and I think we've covered all those topics. And so it'd be interesting to get any feedback from this body regarding that document as it stands now.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just one final, thank you. So first, thank you for that.
One last thought.
One last, I promise. So thank you for that distinction. I referenced what was already in black because we've talked about it so much. So thank you, Mr. McLeod, for that recap. And I also noted number 13 talks about GOFA budgeting best practices as appropriate. So then this is a question, and maybe the chair of the committee, could answer, but recognizing that we might have a different budget presentation, and we still have this kind of loose language of the board, the actual level of detail required is going to be determined by the board. Are we expecting another vote on said presentation, or is that just going to be does that make sense? Is it something that the board has to codify if we want to change anything from last year or from what's in this document, or is that going to be an ongoing, more fluid conversation? I just want to make sure I am prepared as we move into those budget conversations, and I'm prepared for that vote in terms of expectations. So maybe that is a question for the chair of this committee, but I hope I was able to convey.
No, I think I had the substance of it, and you will recall that a number of months ago, we dealt with what the chair referred to as the Goldilocks phenomenon, where sometimes we, in the past, had a budget presentation that was sort of a Papa Bear presentation that contained everything. And then the board objected to having that much detail and that much paper, and therefore requested a leaner presentation, and we got into a Mama Bear presentation, which was perhaps a little too lean. And so now we have gone for the Goldilocks approach of finding the amount that is just right. But it is up to this board, beginning with this committee, to make that determination. And that's why the policy provides for the board will determine the actual level of detail required. And that will be happening in the discussion item that we will have later in this meeting once we conclude this. Is that responsive to your question, Director Ruja?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Further comments or questions or observations relative to the recommended action on the policy? Hearing none, then let me ask, are there any no votes on this action? Having paused to accord you time to express a no vote and hearing none, the chair determines that this matter passes unanimously with all 7 aye votes and no votes and no abstentions on the motion as made by Board Vice Chair Catlin and seconded by Board Second Vice Chair Geisinger. That concludes the recommended action items that we have. We now move to our discussion items, and we have one update that is listed on the agenda. And that discussion item for this evening is for the 2025 proposed budget. And so I would like to ask our Chief Financial Officer once again to step forward, Mr. Doug McLeod, along with Todd Nickel, our Senior Manager of Budget, to present this item. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours with the caveat that you understand that after about 10 or so minutes of presentation, we are going to take our required break for purposes of the CART presentation. So I'll be with you, don't worry, but you may proceed, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank Todd Nickel. He did a lot of the work, most of the work pulling this all together. There are also other individuals that really contributed to this, and I'll talk a little bit about as an organization-wide effort, but in terms of the presentation and the budget book, which is new, Todd Nickel, Heidi Wagner, Lou Cripps from my department and their teams, as well as I'd really like to give a shout out to Stuart Summers, Chief Communications and Engagement Officer, for his efforts in pulling together this budget book, as well as John McKay. So wanted to get that out of the way. There are a lot of people involved in it. We're really proud of the budget book that's an attachment to this, provides lots of good information. So without further ado, I will just run through these 18 slides as expeditiously as possible. So this evening, Todd and I will hit on a few topics here. We'll talk about the background of the budget, just a level set about what the budget's about, how it's developed. We'll talk about the assumptions that have been used in the 2025 proposed budget, and then we'll go through some of the financial information, and then finally talk about next steps for the board and the Finance and Planning Committee. So regarding the background, this meeting is a discussion item, as the chair stated. So this is a draft budget or a proposed 2025 budget that we're putting forth for discussion purposes at this point in time. It allows for a comments period. So we'll talk at the final slide, we'll talk about next steps, but essentially moving forward, what this is a discussion item in October. We're required by state statutes as a government agency to post this budget. It's already been posted on the website. It's been posted in the board office. And we'll also post a notice that it's available within 2 daily newspaper publications. And that's kind of an antiquated concept. We post in the Denver Post, as well as the Boulder Daily Camera, notify community members that the budget is available for public inspection. And we as an agency are looking for feedback, not only from the committee and the board of RTD, but also public feedback regarding the proposed 2025 budget. The approval of the proposed budget will be sought by staff in November at the November 12th Finance and Planning Committee, and then final approval would be requested from the full board at the subsequent board meeting. Between now and then, of course, we do have the budget book, and what we will include between now and that next presentation that we're asking for approval is any changes that have been made between the 2 versions. So it's very transparent as to, if there were additional changes that were made. We think the budget's in substantially final form, don't anticipate changes. We may run across a couple wording changes, maybe a few numbers that we want to true up, but we'll disclose all that to this committee at the next presentation. So regarding the budget development itself, I mentioned it was a very collaborative effort. Every department was involved. This is a multi-month, it's a year-round effort. We as staff hold monthly budget meetings and we review progress on actual expenditures versus budget, discuss issues, discuss where there might be additional funding or funding that can be taken back and put into the general fund. A lot of that discussion occurs constantly throughout the year, and it culminates in several meetings closer towards this meeting where we all come together with the general manager and discuss initiatives, discuss what the results are, what the proposed budget numbers are. So it's a large effort across the entire organization. Pretty much everybody's involved for the most part. I would just like to point out that we did have the 5-year financial forecast for 2025 through 2029, which is a planning document that Finance and Planning Committee approved as well as the full board approved in September. That is used as guidance to ensure that we're not just looking at one fiscal year for the budget appropriation, but we're actually looking at several years out, carrying those expenditures and initiatives forward to ensure that our forecasted revenues align with our forecasted expenditures so that RTD can maintain fiscal sustainability and maintain a good financial position. And then, of course, it aligns with strategic initiatives. You'll see that throughout the budget book itself. There's references to certain strategic initiatives and the initiatives that we are undertaking or tasks we are undertaking, how they relate to those strategic initiatives. So I've mentioned the budget book. So in the past, what we've done is different versions of the presentation materials for the public and the board to see regarding proposed budgets. This is an expanded version. So we're really trying to include everything within this budget book. There are several sections that I'll mention here in a few minutes, but it's very comprehensive. It talks about the history of RTD, and then it goes into actual results for this year. Then it talks a little bit about 2025 proposed initiatives and funding requests. There's a whole lot of detail. In the past, we've provided additional schedules and things kind of in different places, but we really are happy with the way this turned out with communications department help. I think it's a very good reference document, not only for the budget, but just for a lot of things. You can see what's happened over history in RTD and many of the initiatives and accomplishments that have happened within the last year for sure. So we believe it's being very responsive to a lot of board feedback that we got last November and October in 2023 for the 2024 budget. We've incorporated all that feedback. It includes Office of the State Auditor recommendations in terms of presentations. One thing to note is within the appendix, there's a much more detailed document that shows, if anybody is interested, you can see it broken down with a 3-year comparison, comparing projected or 2023 actual results with 2024 budget, 2024 projections through the end of this year, and then the 2025 budget. So it breaks it down by base and fast track. So hopefully everything's in there that anybody could possibly think of looking at. By the way, on the board feedback, I would point out that on April 16th at the Finance and Planning Committee, April 16th, 2024, we did come back to this committee and propose some changes to the actual budget presentation and materials and receive feedback. So all of that is included in addition to the feedback we received at the last proposed budget presentation for 2024. And then I mentioned earlier, the 2025 fiscal policy changes have been included within the budget. And we believe this budget book not only provides additional information internally, but it provides quite a bit more transparency. There's a lot of information within there, hopefully something for everybody. And it's not just numbers. So I mentioned that I was briefly going to go over the budget book contents, and I'd really ask that everybody please go through that book. It's 84 pages. There's really good information in there. If there's something missing that you're seeing, please provide feedback during this interim period, and we can try to include that information within the final budget book. But as I mentioned, it starts with agency information, fiscal and budgetary policies, executive summary. Everything's all encompassed within one document this time, so users don't have to go hunt and peck to try to find information such as the fiscal policy, which was previously, a separate document. It's all right there contained within the budget book. There's a summary by fiscal year. As I mentioned, that's a state requirement that the OSA, Office of the State Auditor, pointed out that we were lacking in some of our filings in previous years. There's highlights of key initiatives for both 2024 and 2025. And I would really highly recommend, in addition to the number, that if you skip everything else, that's one really good section to take a look at, 2024 in particular. It's quite astonishing what we've completed as an agency in the past year. So lots of good information in there. Cash flow and supplemental schedules. So I mentioned there's an appendix in the back that shows it by fund. It goes into a lot of detail. It's a spreadsheet for all intents and purposes, so not really pretty to look at. But we've also included towards the back, before the appendix, cash flows by department as well, comparative cash flows. And I think that's pretty informative because below each cash flow by department, it also discusses initiatives that are contemplated for 2025. So what are some of the basic assumptions that we've included within here? We mentioned being very conservative on our revenue assumptions when we had the 5-year financial forecast discussion. Same thing applies to our budget, and that's embedded within our fiscal policies. We want to be very conservative about our revenue assumptions. So we've used the medium forecast that was just discussed by CU leads. So we're not taking the optimistic or the pessimistic. The median is usually what we come closest to historically. So we're using that median assumption. We're not assuming things like oil and gas revenues at this point within the budget from Senate Bill 24-230. We are including Senate Bill 24-32, which is Zero Fare for Youth of $5 million. So all that is discussed within the narrative about revenues, expenditures, et cetera. So I believe from a transparency standpoint, it provides a pretty good understanding of what's in each line item that we will be requesting for appropriation. Again, strategic plan initiatives within the strategic plan priority, lots of references to what those initiatives, particularly within the departments, referencing which strategic initiatives each one of those individual departmental initiatives supports. The transit asset management plan, this was a big topic of discussion at last year's budget request approval meeting with the Finance Planning Committee as well as the board. There wasn't enough information, and some of the information was difficult to understand. So also in the appendix is the transit asset management plan. That lists by project. We've cleaned up the names so we believe they're understandable and transparent for public consumption. It has the years that we expect to plan to repair and replace those assets. It also has the amount. So hopefully that provides some good reference material for those that are interested in the details of future capital expenditures as well as 2025 capital expenditures. And we want to align this budget with being able to achieve our performance metrics. Certainly, that's not the primary reason we want to build it around our core mission, but we want to make sure that whatever we budget for, that we have the ability to continue to achieve our performance metrics, especially from a financial perspective, maintaining fiscal sustainability, maintaining our credit ratings, and also being able to provide information to the public to show just how we're performing on a trended basis for those financial metrics. Again, it meets fiscal 2025 fiscal policy requirements that we asked the board to approve, or the committee to approve this evening. And then finally, I would just mention that fiscal sustainability certainly is a concern from a financial aspect. But one of the things that we've really tried to take a much better approach is we're having these monthly budget conversations by department, and then larger conversations where we bring everybody together for that collaboration, is to really focus on our non-financial resources, so human resources, the ability to do throughput through the whole procurement process for certain projects. In the past, we leaned more towards whether funding was available or not. With these more recent iterations, and it's part of the new financial planning process we spoke about during the 5-year financial forecast presentation and the new planning process. We're going to go through 3 generations over the next 3 years. One of the most immediate ones is to really align our non-financial resource, make sure we have the human capital, make sure we have the throughput to actually achieve these things, taking into consideration lead times, costs of items, et cetera. So we feel that this is a much more robust plan in terms of looking at each of those details. proposed budget considerations for 2025. So I mentioned that we include only certain revenues, so we're excluding certain revenues as well. So something that's not certain, we're not going to include, and that's from the standpoint of being conservative and not overly optimistic. If we do realize those revenues in the future, that's just additional funding. And then we'd also, if there's strings attached or spending requirements for those additional revenues, we'd include those as well. We are including any Tabor revenue growth limitations. Currently, we don't believe there to be any impacts based on current information, including the most recent sales and use tax forecast. In the 5-year financial forecast, with current information, we think the most likely scenario at this point in time would be a potential small refund of about $2 million in 2027 and $3 million in 2029. Of course, if that changes, we would keep the board informed and approach it according to our fiscal policy. The budget itself was built around funding for operations, maintenance, the transit asset management plan, and debt service. Those are the key categories. We're still working on maturing the TAM information. You'll see in the TAM schedule, it's very detailed. But with $9.3 billion, that was one of the things we talked about in our 3-generation financial planning process. We continue to gather information, build inventories of assets, and do condition assessments, such as with the light rail reconstruction project. We're getting a lot of information as that embedded track is pulled up and replaced about the condition and wear of assets over a period of time. And then again, people power is a determining factor. When I talk about throughput, we talk about people power as being one of our 3 strategic initiatives. We've made a lot of progress, as you've seen from Chief People Officer Pileggi's quarterly reports on staffing, hiring, and retention. But our ability as an agency to actually carry out initiatives is almost 100% dependent on people power. So we're people in the people moving business, and we depend on those people. So these initiatives, including the system optimization plan, really has been budgeted under the assumption that we will achieve those people power goals. Moving into financial information. So here's just a quick graphic, and this is within the budget book as well. Just shows a trend line about RTD's projected revenues. I would just point out that in the bar chart there, those blue lines represent the one-time funding we received from COVID. That's no longer the case. 2024 budget, there's a big spike in that year because we've assumed and the board appropriated the expenditure to pass through grant funding for the Colfax BRT project. So there's approximately $170 million in revenue in there. So that's one-time revenue as well. So if you look at just the 2025 budget, it's essentially flat because we're being conservative to our historical results. Don't expect a lot of increases in 2024. We implemented the new fare structure, which lowered fares a little bit. Those still only make up about 5% of total revenue. So it's pretty much everything in our revenue is based on sales and use taxes, and we're using the forecast from CU Leads. And then the second largest item is operating and capital grants. We have not assumed any capital grants. We're just only assuming, and again, this is in the budget book, we're only assuming receipt of primarily of the FTA Section 5307 preventive maintenance grants. So those are apportioned every year. That's all we're including to be conservative. On the expenditure side, the outflow side, this is where the appropriation request will come in that we'll be asking the board for in November. So currently, what we have for appropriations, you can see on the screen here. So a total expenditure appropriation of $1,267 million. That's pretty well in line with what the board was asked to appropriate for 2024, the current year that we're in. But you can see the breakdown there. The largest expense, of course, is operating expenses, our core business services, providing service to customers. Debt interest and principal payments total about $229 million. That's pretty steady throughout every year, but a significant burden at about 20%, a little less than 20% of our RTD's revenues. And then new capital expenditures. What you don't see here yet, and what we will bring with the final appropriation, is the capital carry forward, which generated some discussion last year. Same ideas that we'll have very good descriptions, have that broken down and much more presentable for transparency and better understanding. It's not included at this point because it's capital that was already appropriated for, that we'll ask the board to appropriate again for and carry that funding forward in 2025. That money is already set aside. We like to wait until we can reconcile that entire amount towards the latter part of the fiscal year, so that it's as accurate as can be, because there's constantly work going on. The light rail reconstruction project is a good example. And then you can see in the reserve section, total fund appropriation. This aligns with the 2025 fiscal policy, where we have the 4 basic fund categories. So all the money that's left over on the balance sheet that hasn't been spoken for and there's not a liability for, this projects towards the end of the year what those balances would look like. We talked quite at length about this in the 5-year financial forecast presentation, so I won't belabor the point, but the fast track internal savings account, 190 million, that's projected to stay flat in 2025, because some of that funding contribution, about 22 million that will go in there, actually is going to be used to fund the increase in the concessionaire agreement for the commuter rail with Denver Transit Partners. There's a couple of spikes over the next few years in which RTD agreed in the contract to fund certain repairs and maintenance, periodic repairs and maintenance of RTD's assets, which are under the auspices or the operational control right now of Denver Transit Partners. Just quickly, this is a breakdown. Again, this is in the budget book, breakdown of the proposed expenditures. And this one happens to exclude capital expenditures. It is operating expenses. It shows it by category on the left, and then by department on the right. The only thing I would point out here is that I mentioned people power. Wages and benefits are the largest category. And in fact, the purchase transportation, which is the term used for contracted services, where we have contractors provide direct service to our customers, the vast majority of those expenditures are also wages and benefits. Since RTD owns the assets, the contractors provide basically personnel and the management of those personnel. So if you add those two together, 70% or so of RTD's costs go towards personnel costs for providing service. Just spend a couple minutes here on this. This really aligns the 2025 budget requested column, really aligns closely with what we presented in the 5-year financial forecast. And then for comparison purposes, on the left most column of numbers, you can see the 2024 current budget. So we're doing a comparative comparison of the cash flows that are projected for this year, for the remainder of the year, as well as 2025. Just so this committee can see what has changed. A couple items to point out on row 3 there, grant revenue and other income. You can see the difference is due to the 2024 budgeting of the pass-through grant as revenue. That pass-through grant goes right to Denver. RTD is the recipient of those funds, and as part of our efforts to partner with so many different agencies, we are the direct recipient from the FTA to receive those grants, administer them correctly, and oftentimes pass them through. So you'll see that that's decreasing for that one-time grant funding. And then there's a commensurate offset in row 7 where the expenditures are lowered. When you look at 2025 versus 2024, it's primarily due to the in and out that happens in 2024 that no longer happens in 2025. Just quickly, a couple other items, salaries and benefits. I mentioned just briefly. That is our largest number there on row 5. You can see the increase of 54 million or 14.8%. That is primarily due to the 2 initiatives of the comprehensive operational analysis or system optimization plan. As we continue to build staffing, that number grows along with that towards achievement of that SOP. And then materials and supplies, that's a fairly large percentage increase, $12 million. We've seen pretty steep increases in parts and supplies for maintaining our fleet and facilities. That continues. I would point out that last week, RTD did complete a lock of diesel fuel prices, and I won't talk about the details of that. I'm not sure if General Manager Johnson has had a chance to communicate with the board yet, but that's something we do every year, try to get some budget certainty out of locking fuel prices. And then I think the only other item that I wanted to point out, is down in row 15, capital expenditures. So why that number is 185 million in 2024 is because it includes the capital carry forward. And then it's only the $35.8 million in 2025. When we come back to the board, you'll see that shift. Whatever was not completed in 2024 will be moved over to 2025, along with the funding that will essentially come from fund balances. So no real change to the bottom line when you compare those two, and we'll continue to see RTD meet its fiscal policy fund balance requirements. And then, Mr. Chair, I know that you discussed a break. This is the last slide. So this is just an indication of the schedule going forward. So here we are, October, with a discussion item with the 2025 proposed budget. There's a very comprehensive budget book. Highly recommend everybody takes a good look at that. Todd and I are available for questions if you go through the normal process through the board office. Be happy to get any feedback, answer any questions that anybody has. Next step would be to come back to this committee with a proposed recommended 2025 budget. And as I mentioned, there will probably be some small changes in some of those numbers and maybe some of the descriptions, depending on what feedback we get, some of the narrative items in the budget book. That budget book has a proposed slash across that. Once the full board approves the 2025 budget, we'll post that without the watermarks on it. And then finally, if the board sees fit to approve that 2025 budget, the budget would be in effect January 1st, 2025. And we do not plan to do an amended budget. This year, 2024, is the first time we did not do an amended budget. And that's worked out pretty well for us and helped in the financial planning process to be much more involved and exact in what our projections are. So, Mr. Chair, with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. Well done and well timed. We will, at this time, take a break in order to, as I indicated before, allow the CART people to have a break from their very fine services in giving us these instant transcripts to review. For that reason, we will now stand in recess until 7:25 p.m. At that point, we'll return for questions, comments, observations that any committee member or any director may have for Mr. McLeod or anyone else relative to the discussion item on our 2025 proposed budget. So, ladies and gentlemen, we stand in recess until 7:25 p.m. Thank you. This is your 2-minute warning. This is your 2-minute warning. We'll commence the meeting again in 2 minutes. Good evening and welcome back to the October 8, 2024 meeting of the RTD Finance and Planning Committee. This is Doug Tisdale, the chair of the committee, and we are in the middle of our discussion item, which relates to the proposed 2025 budget. We have concluded an excellent presentation by our Chief Financial Officer, Doug McLeod, relative to the proposed budget. You have had an opportunity previously in the board materials for your packet to see the 84-page budget book that has been prepared. Hopefully, the Goldilocks just right amount of information for all of you. And as you know, anything that you wish in addition to that will be made available, and in fact is available, generally speaking, on the website for RTD and otherwise. But we now will have discussion by committee members relative to the budget proposal and other directors as well. And we'll begin with the board vice chair, Peggy Catlin. Dr. Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. McLeod, thank you very much. I breezed through the budget book and I was very pleased with it. I just think that you've captured some of the board members' requests, but I also think that it's a very good public-facing document. And so I just wanted to say, I'm going to look into it in more detail, but at my first review of those many pages, I was very impressed. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Catlin. And, you know, the general manager CEO read my mind because I was about to call upon her and ask her if she had any thoughts or observations that she wanted to share with the board regarding the presentation that her chief financial officer put together. So, Madam General Manager, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Committee Chair Tisdale, and thank you also, First Chair Catlin, for your comments. One thing that struck a chord with me when you mentioned a forward-facing document, I'd be remiss not to state, the intent here was to ensure that we were providing information to our constituents collectively as we look and understand that they are funding our system. But more to the point, there is a website that we are launching that will have the board document. And it was intentional on our parts collectively, as you noticed, it's proposed going forward. So recognizing that when this body does take the budget under consideration, we could have that at the ready and it's easier for us to update collectively. And then a very important portion of the budget book as well is calling out what our actual operating budget is and our capital budget, because oftentimes we get questions and it's difficult to deduce. So I just wanted to ensure that I qualified those certain changes because we recognize that we had the information readily available, but you had to be a good sleuth to find it. And with having a website with a link directly to the budget, it will be a lot more navigable for people on our website. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And once again, I would like to publicly take the opportunity to commend the finance and budget team, as well as our communications and engagement staff, specifically Stuart Summers, as well as John McKay and the leadership team as a whole, as we came together and we started upon this process. It was intentional in the sense of us reviewing the budget, I should say, on a monthly basis, leaning in, recognizing that we have strategic initiatives and how they tie in collectively with our performance metrics. For those of you that have tuned into the performance committee, you can see how we're going about this, and there's great intention and purpose in reference to what we're doing and how we're going forward. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you, Madam General Manager, CEO. Words well taken. And yes, it was very obvious to see the hands of both Stuart Summers and John McKay hard at work in the presentation that has been given to us with this budget book. Other directors' comments and questions? Vice Chair Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod and Mr. Nickel. Great work. I spent a lot of time with this today, most of my day actually, reading through it in detail. So I will have questions and I'll follow up with you on those. But to the point, this book creates an opportunity to tell the story that we need to tell about what our budget's looking like, where it has been and where it's going, which is really, really important. It's one of the things that I personally was hoping for. And I will tell you, I was very nervous when I got through the first 15 pages and it was pretty narrative and not a lot of detail. But then I finally got to the appendix and I was like, all right, here we go. So great job on that. And then I just want to really highlight right before the appendix is the piece that you talked about with the departmental breakdowns and what's going on there. Super, super helpful to understand some of those line items that are, they're not, a line item's a line item. It has a title and it doesn't have a lot of explanation with it. So the one-page document that is in the appendix that can be looked at, that's just a spreadsheet, has more flesh on it when you look at these different departmental pieces and how they're working together. I say that because when we look at the values of RTD and the mission for connection, this is pulling disparate parts of our agency together and making it very clear what we're doing and how we're working together. So it's a very holistic view of what's going on within the agency. I'm certain that there are going to be questions about line items and specific things that will come to us through the constituents that read this and through the customers that are looking at it. But I do want to emphasize that there's quite a bit more detail here last year, and it tracks with how we discussed the budget going into 2024 previously, that you and I sat down and spent quite a few hours tackling. So thank you for the hard work. And to all of the department heads, CEO Johnson, thank you for making sure that everybody had a part in this. And this is truly a document that represents the one RTD ideal that you are striving towards. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. Director Rusha, you are recognized.
Thank you, sir. I have a few points of feedback, and if it's okay, I'll just go through. Okay, thank you, sir. So first, thank you very much, Mr. McLeod and team. I would absolutely read all 1,000 pages if you went there, but what's good for the goose sometimes isn't good for the gander or the other goose. So I just really appreciate this work and where we're going with our budget presentation. Just a few points of feedback in terms of, clarity for the board and for the public. On packet page 173, I think I got that right. We talk about operating expenses, and salaries and benefits is like a line. And I don't know if we capture this elsewhere in a snapshot summary. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it would be helpful if we, similar like to the comprehensive financial report, if we had the actual budgeted staff positions, agency wide. So how many do we have this year, and how many do we have budgeted for the next year? I know we can go through each department page and maybe collect that information, but that was something that I was looking for. And again, if there's a page where that was summarized and I missed it, please call it out. And then as for the dollar amount, I know sometimes in the past, and I think in the ACFR we have kind of summarized, like, break it down further. So fringe benefits, payroll taxes, that kind of thing. And while I get that might be in another, like, those things I just mentioned are in other parts of this budget document, I couldn't find like a table that just kind of encapsulated, sort of staff overhead costs, if that makes sense. And so that would just be just a request of mine. And I think it might also, help moving forward to, just, for the public consumption. And then I have a question regarding the TAM plan, or on page 174, like, is that essentially like a placeholder? Do we expect any amendments? You can sort of see it's, there's not a number for capital carry forward, for example. Should we expect amendments to this like we have in previous years?
As to that specific question, I think Ms. McLeod already indicated that there would be an adjustment at the end of the year. Obviously, when we get closer to finalization and have better information from Ms. McLeod, let you expand upon that.
Thank you. Yes, and it will be an additional schedule that we'll add, similar to page 174, I believe it is, that you're referring to capital expenditures. Those are the new capital expenditures that come from the TAM plan, just associated with 2025. In the appendix is the remainder of the TAM plan that goes out several years beyond 2025. But for the capital carry forward itself, it would be a separate schedule that will look very similar to this new capital expenditure schedule that will detail out what we're carrying forward, how much, and that would be our intent going forward for the next iteration.
Thanks. So just wanted to make sure that I had understood that properly, where the information would be going, and also again, just for the public, so I don't even know if it's possible, for us to, make any other notations, or if this is what is already being published. Does that make sense? Like, is this our publication? Because I think even just that note to the public would be helpful. But I mean, does that kind of make sense what I'm saying, Mr. McLeod? And I understand that something might get updated later, but if I could see where somebody could have just confusion looking at the page. And then just a general comment, like, I really, really like the department by department layout. And I was wondering if we could also include a separate table, like, for like TAM expenditures. So for example, the police department will get new vehicles, and we can include like a disclaimer that these expenditures are part of another line item or from a different fund, but it does give, I think, that comprehensive snapshot. It's still high level, but it's like a department. It's a department expense, even if we've categorized it otherwise. And not being a person who does budget presentations, I'm hoping that Mr. McLeod can kind of get what I'm saying and maybe translate. But to that end, just like moving into the TAM plan and that presentation, starting on packet page 194. So I mean, looking at this, I'm just going on the assumption, I think you just said it, Mr. McLeod, this is capital carry forward. And we don't have any new expenditures here, and I didn't see anything that looked new to me. So just explaining that, I think would be helpful. And irrespective if you can make inferences or deductions elsewhere in the document, I just had a couple of points of feedback that I think would help board members and the public understand this chart better. So in the first and second columns, we have department and title. And I was wondering, under department, can we categorize that by department? So I think we have it categorized by function, but like support fleet isn't a department, I don't think. So just, I think that could provide better clarity if we did actually categorize it by department. Particularly if we don't make those notations in the department summaries, just so it kind of flows. And then maybe even we have like title and location, maybe those two columns could be combined, for space sake. And then in the last three columns where we have a dollar amount, a percentage, and a fiscal year, just recognizing that our capital carry forward, allows us to essentially plan out projects over multi-year projects, right? I think it would be helpful if we said this is what year this project was originally approved by the board, and then maybe just the original amount or the original appropriation, and then what's left of it. I see we have that percentage, so just kind of that like distinction or that timeline would be helpful for going into the budget, and then anybody looking back, like our next set of directors looking back to this budget. I think that would just provide some clarity. And then I'm just looking at my notes here. Sorry. And then for like new expenditures, those should be noted. And I understand there's going to be we expect an amendment, right, for new CapEx, or whether it's part of the TAM plan or not. Just make sure in this document that we're noting like this is new in this fiscal year, so it's pretty clear when we're looking at it. And then under the descriptions, I think a few could just be more descriptive, especially if we're just like restating, the title. But one thing I remember, it wasn't always every cell or every line, but in the past, when we would get these, like the TAM plan or, any amendments, there's often a rationale. So I can see what we're buying, but the why. So yes, I can go back to the, budget summary, the letter to the public, and I could draw a line, but I think it would just be helpful because we went through this work of doing this amazing like snapshot table of, putting in the why in that description, so we had the justification for the board and for the public, and the board can explain I voted for this budget, and they can clearly, kind of outline, particularly on the larger items. And then finally, speaking of larger items, it comes in just to my last thought is that some of these line items, and I've opined this before, we might otherwise describe them as like capital improvement projects, and we don't have like a separate SIP document. But I think, if we have a project that has multiple components versus a more direct, capital expenditure, so that a piece of equipment or even fleet replacement, I think we would just benefit in, either breaking that down further or, making sure that, I would say break that down further, because we might say it's we're going to spend, I'm just pulling this out of the air, $62 million on some light rail improvement project. But I don't know what portion of that is, for a consultant, what part of that is materials, just things like that. I think it would be helpful with these larger capital projects if we had a bit of a breakdown and a narrative that also would include, expected dates of completion. And again, I know we don't have like a SIP book, but something even if it is more summarized or, just focusing on the big projects, that could be included, before we vote, I think would be very helpful to the board and also to the public. But overall, I'm very excited about where we're going, and I appreciate staff's responsiveness to input, and it is that Goldilocks thing, trying to figure out where we land. So again, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing this process just continue to improve, and really appreciate all the work that staff did. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Rusha. A lot to chew on there, Mr. McLeod. Anything that you would like to respond to specifically right now? Many of those were simply suggestions for your consideration, obviously, as we go forward. But is there anything that you would like to respond to specifically before I go to Board Second Vice Chair Geisinger?
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chair, and just a general comment. I really appreciate we really appreciate the feedback, and yeah, definitely take these things into consideration and incorporating those. So great feedback, and that's what we're looking for. So thank you, Director Rusha.
Yeah, and that's why it's here as a discussion item tonight, is for exactly that reason. Second Vice Chair Geisinger, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. McLeod, and all of your team, and Ms. Johnson. I think the book looks really good. I look forward to spending some more time with it over the next couple of weeks as well. My question is packet page 168. It talks about key initiatives. RTD, this may be a question more for Ms. Johnson, I'm guessing, but RTD will continue to pursue the strategic initiatives of people power, back to basics, and welcoming transit environment with the introduction of customer and community connections during fiscal year 2025. The 2021 to 2026 strategic plan allows for modifications as necessary with board approval. And then it goes on to talk about tactics. I'm happy to see that you're looking at customer and community connections. I'm interested to learn more. Is that, it sounds like it's a modification that will be coming to the board for approval?
And perhaps our general manager would like to weigh in first before going to Mr. McLeod.
Yes, thank you very kindly, Chair Tisdale, and thank you, Second Vice Chair, for your question. So just some clarity. Recognizing at the outset of the presentation, Mr. McLeod did reference how we're using performance metrics and how this is tied to our strategic plan. I wanted to qualify my statement by saying we have strategic initiatives, and those strategic initiatives are spawned from survey data that we were able to garner, be it in the employee survey, the community value survey, or the customer satisfaction survey. Hence, that's how we got to the whole understanding of the welcoming transit environment, people power, and focused on back to basics. That includes our TAM, right, as a critical element. Moving forward, as we talk about customer and community connection, just on Monday just yesterday with the performance committee, whereby we had our consultant partner from ETC talk about the key drivers, as we talked more specifically about where people want to go, the activity centers that could be geared toward employment sites. I believe Secretary Guzman had raised that issue relative to a comprehensive operational analysis. So as we look at that, that's our intentional initiative relative to that information that we garnered from those surveys. So when we talk about if we make modifications to the strategic plan, quite naturally, that will come to the board. Case in point, what we did with the financial metrics that you all acted on at the performance committee that will go forward to the full board. Relative to strategic initiatives, those are the elements that are incorporated into a work plan that individuals are doing that are built upon within the division and the department to help move the needle relative to those key drivers. So no, the customer and community connections are there. Those are work plans that are being encapsulated going forward in people's performance plans. So that will not come to the board per se, but the overarching end result, which will be incorporated, i.e. with a leading indicator when you talk about key performance metrics, or a lagging indicator as we went through previously. So that's what that means. Did that address your question?
I guess sort of, but it says the strategic plan allows for modifications as necessary with board approval and talks about changing the strategic initiative. So I assumed it would come to the board.
Excuse me if I may, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, Director Geisinger, I didn't mean to jump over you, but this goes back to we're not changing elements of the strategic plan. What we're doing is focusing on initiatives to help us improve the overarching success outcomes. And one laser-like approach we're taking is focusing on community and customer connections. It's the same aspect about people power, using that as an example. We shared that with you all. I didn't come to the board and ask, can we focus on a campaign whereby we're utilizing our veterans that are employees to have a more laser-like approach when we're looking at promoting job opportunities within the organization? So an initiative is the elements, and that's what's encapsulated in the strategic plan, where it talks about based upon impact, or excuse me, not impact, input, these things can be modified. So we're not changing the strategic plan priorities. We're talking about what initiatives that we're undertaking that incorporate tactics and work plans going forward.
Okay.
And I think, Director Geisinger, what I hear is there is that subtle difference between a strategy and a tactic. And we, as the board, have set the strategic plan, the strategy, and we have charged General Manager CEO with the responsibility for giving us the tactics to achieve those strategies. And I think
Oh, yeah, I understand that. Thanks.
all right, thank you. All right, and Director Broom, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question about vacancy savings. Does the current budget cover funding for full employment within the system, or do we factor in, say, a 5-7% vacancy saving into the budget document itself, recognizing we always end up having that?
Yeah, Mr. McLeod, that's an excellent question.
Thank you, and I'll ask Todd to supplement my comments. Yes, we do factor in vacancy savings just based on historical turnover that we experience. However, on the front end, we do budget by position. So we have a budget in there for every position that is fully funded, but we know there's going to be turnover and vacancy savings that occur throughout the year. So we kind of use a historical average to apply against those fully loaded costs for an individual position. In addition, we're also very sure to make sure that if there's new positions or other positions that have a specific hiring time frame, we don't just assume we're going to hire everybody on January 1st. We work this process of doing interdependent conversations. So if I'm in operations and I need new employees, I have a conversation with the Human Resources Department about not only about the efficacy of hiring for those positions, but also when can it be, when would it be possible to execute on that. So I mentioned a little bit about the non-financial resources and actually making the execution of these initiatives and tasks happen. So there's a lot of consideration taken into that. So we have vacancy savings, and we also look at the timing of when those positions are likely to be filled. So, and Todd, would you add anything to that?
I would say, yes, that's basically what you said is accurate. I can tell you that, Director Broom, that we have vacancy savings of $15 million budget. I can't tell you what percentage that is, but I can tell you that's the amount that we have programmed in.
And then I guess as a follow-up, how have you funded pensions?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, and I'm sorry, Mr. McLeod. I was going to say, we'll come back to General Manager Johnson. She had her hand raised, and I think was going to weigh in on that first question. And I'm wondering, perhaps Director Broom will hold off on pension for a second. Let me let General Manager CEO Johnson weigh in on the first part.
Thank you
Thank
very
you. That's fine.
Thank you very much, Chair Still, and thank you, Director Broom. All I just wanted to add for a little extra color as we talk about the vacancy savings and picking up on what CFO McLeod talked about with the full-time equivalents, as we look at the one RTD approach and have to ensure that we have ample resources to hire for said positions. in some instances, when you look at the vacancy savings for all intents and purposes, we have been intentional when positions have been put forward. So for instance, we may look at 50% of the FTE because we know good and well we can't hire until July in reference to the mechanisms going forward. So I just wanted to qualify that a little more as we talk about whether or not we have for within the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity, we have to ensure that the position and the salaries are justified as we look at adhering to state laws and things of the like. So if we don't have an EEO representative that can do that, then we're pushing out that timeline. So I just wanted to say, as the One RTD approach is not just having the resources and human resources, it's the other components that go hand in hand. And hence that's how we get to maybe a fraction of that full-time equivalent going forward. And that's another factor in the vacancy savings. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak on that.
Absolutely. We appreciate the additional information. And Lynn, let's go to the second question that Director Broom had. And Mr. McLeod, if you can lead off on that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question, Director Broom. So I'll divide this into two categories regarding budgeted pension contributions, one being the represented staff and the other being the non-represented staff. I'll start with the non-represented staff. What we've included for pension contributions, so there are two retirement plans for which RTD contributes and which are part of the appropriation process. One is the closed defined benefit pension plan, which closed on January 1st, 2008 to new employees. Subsequent to that, there was a defined contribution. It's called a Section 401A plan under the IRS rules, similar to a 401k plan in the private sector. For what we've done for the budget on those non-represented employee plans is followed the recommendation that came from the salaried plan trustees, which include yourself, Director Broom, as you're well aware, and Director Deschel. The unanimous recommendation from that committee, which I've shared with General Manager, was to include a $15 million lump sum again this year to the pension plan. And then on the 401A plan for all employees hired January 1st, 2008 and thereafter that are non-represented, continuing the 9% of wages contribution. That's been consistent for decades now, and the board has a policy of authorizing between 7 and 9% contributions. There was only one point in time as we were entering COVID where that recommended contribution dropped down to 7. It was restored to 9%. Subsequent to that, that's what we're recommending on the non-represented employee side. Regarding the represented employee side, as you're well aware, we are in contract negotiations, staff's in contract negotiations for the contract that expires, the collective bargaining agreement or CBA that expires at the end of this year, December 31st, 2024. What we've contemplated in the budget for pension contributions is continuation of the current regime, although that that would be negotiated through contracts going forward, but at least we have a provision in there for RTD to continue to contribute the 13% RTD contribution to the plan, to the defined benefit pension plan for represented employees in the Amalgamated Transit Union. As you know, that plan closed to new employees on January 1st, 2023. Similar situation where the new employees since that point that are represented by the ATU are enrolled in the 401A plan. That plan includes in the budget a 9% contribution as well. They also have the opportunity to voluntarily, as employees, contribute an additional 5% of their own wages towards that plan, which RTD will match. So 9% contribution guaranteed into the 401A plan plus up to a 5% matching contribution has been included in the budget.
Director Broom, does that respond to your questions?
It does, Mr. Chair, for time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. We appreciate that. Always an important topic to make sure that we address relative to the budget to discuss the pension plans. Other directors with questions, comments, or observations relative to this discussion item on the proposed budget. Once again, Director Ruscia.
Thank you, sir. So I, in looking at packet page packet pages 193 and 194. So we note the leadership team on 193, and then packet page 194, there's an organizational structure. We don't have an org chart. And if I'm looking at this, I want to say these are our departments. Is that correct? And I don't, again, just for clarity's sake, if that is the case, then we should just identify like these are the departments, within RTD. And I don't know if there's even just a, just so that is more clear, especially if we have a department breakdown. Does that make sense? I think it's really helpful to note, what initiatives or what parts of operations are rolling up under what category, but we don't specifically say departments. And I think because we say it elsewhere in the document, just that consistency would be good. And then I did have a question that might be better for operations. I was going to ask it tomorrow, but so I guess if it's permissible, because it's somewhat noted here, if I could ask it.
We'll ask and we'll find out.
Okay, I want to make sure I don't color outside the lines, Mr. Chair. So we don't currently have a COO, and I'm not suggesting that needs to be just a blank spot on the leadership chart. But I was actually wondering, is that a position we are going to fill, or are we going to move forward with a different like leadership or organization, like a model? And so that would be for, I think, GM CEO Johnson to answer, but it was a question I had for tomorrow. And I can sort of see it in the, you know what I mean? I'm looking at a budget right now, so it popped back into my head.
Well, I thank you for that. I think it is appropriate for tomorrow rather than tonight, and at least you previewed the question for the general manager. That having been said, her hand is raised, so I will recognize her now.
Thank you very much, Chair Tisdale. And my response is more broad brushed. It goes back to the question you originally posed, Director Arusha, when you talked about whether or not there was an organizational chart. I believe everyone assembled here recognizes that I commission an organizational development and workplace assessment. And as we look at what we're doing going forward, there are a couple of recruitments that will be underway. Hence, I have worked with Mr. McLeod to plan for said positions. That will lead departments. The departments could be renamed, but being very intentional in reference to ensuring we allocate the appropriate funds going forward relative to said positions. And so getting back to your second question, yes, there will be a chief operating officer that will be hired to lead the modalities, including service planning within the organization. So there you have my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Arusha, I see your hand is still raised. Is there yet another point you wanted to bring to our attention now?
Yeah, just so thank you for that, GMCO Johnson. Sometimes it's impossible to completely unlink operations from finance, and so but if there were some major structural change that could also impact, where we're allocating budget dollars, so that department dollars. So thank you for that. And then I just have sort of like just a general request that I am just reminded from last year when we get, when we look at like the, kind of like the bottom line sheet of expenditures, by category. And in the past, we've we have lumped Access-a-Ride, On Demand and FlexRide in the same category. But because, two of those three are paratransit, I would just ask that, from this budget and moving forward, we just make that distinction. So that was just the only other comment I had. But thank you for the dialogue and for your patience, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for sharing those observations with us. As I said, it's a discussion item on the second most important thing that this board does. And so we very much appreciate the opportunity to have all directors weigh in. Are there any other directors with observations or comments? I have one that I wanted to share. before we conclude, but I'll open the floor first to any other director with comments, questions, observations relative to this discussion item on the 2025 proposed budget. Seeing none, there is one point that I do want to highlight for the sake of the general public, our constituents, and that is to note that our transit police department is going to have a significant increase in its budget, and its budget will constitute 6% of the entire RTD budget. And I think because there have been so many expressions of concern over safety and security, it is important to communicate to people that we are addressing safety and security, that it is a high priority for this agency, and that we literally put our money where our mouth is when talking about that. So I appreciate that being highlighted. And if you look at, I believe, page 175 depicts that 6% portion of the budget. And page 192 gives the, I'm sorry, I'm talking about packet page 175, and packet page 192 gives the description. Are there other comments relative to this discussion item? Seeing none, we'll conclude that discussion and we turn to other matters. Are there any other matters that any committee member wishes to present for discussion at this time? Hearing none, I will bring one forward, and that is to express publicly our congratulations to General Manager CEO Johnson and to the board regarding the 150 or what maybe it's more than that, I believe, $1 million grant from FTA related to the Colfax Bus Rapid Transit. There was a large show check that was given to us on Friday, demonstrating the federal government's support of our BRT on Colfax, and it's a very exciting development, so I thought it deserved special mention in this meeting. We then turn to our last agenda item, which is to discuss our next meeting. The next meeting will be held on Tuesday, November 12. That's Tuesday, November 12. At that meeting, we are slated to take action on this 2025 budget that we have discussed tonight, as well as appointing 2 directors to serve on both the Salaried Employees Defined Contribution Trust and the Salaried Employees Pension Trust. So important items all. If there are no other matters, and I'll pause again, then since there is no other discussion, I will note that this meeting is adjourned as of 8:07 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you all very much. Have a good night and a pleasant tomorrow.